So yes, so today we're going to look at silicon synapses. So we're going to see what can be done to simulate or actually emulate the properties of synapses for building neural networks. And the plan is to go over just a sort of background on what are synapses, what do they do, what are the models, and then the circuits. Look at the details of different circuit, linear circuits that integrate pulses. That's what synapses do. And then show some examples of nonlinear properties of synapses and the circuits that implement them as well. So we start with real synapses, and real synapses in biology are those elements that actually connect the presynaptic neuron to the postsynaptic neuron. So here you see a picture that was taken from a science engineering visualization challenge. It's already quite old, but it's actually very realistic. This is the end terminal of one axon so it's coming from a neuron. The signal is propagating down, the electrical signal is propagating down. Once it reaches the end, it will trigger a cascade of events, which we will actually see in a few slides, which will then communicate this spike, the action potential, to from the presynaptic neuron to the postsynaptic neuron. So the synapse is actually composed of a presynaptic part and a postsynaptic part. And then this part here on the bottom is what's happening on the cell of the postsynaptic neuron. And typically the receiving side could be receiving signals directly on the cell body. If you think of a neuron just as a single point or like a big sphere, you would be receiving it directly on the cell body. But the neurons, as you know, are not spherical elements. They're actually very complicated 3D structures, and they have complex dendritic arborizations. So they have these tree-like structures that are the places where on the leaves where you receive all the inputs. And then all of these gets sort of integrated together to go to the cell body. So there are these elements very, very far away from the cell body, and many of them that receive these signals. And then depending on the size, the conductance, the distance, the thickness of the dendrite, they can communicate more or less activity, or a higher or lower current, and that gets integrated and goes into the cell body. And it was thought until a few years ago that really the site of computation was the neuron. The neuron is doing the action potential, it's doing the fan in and the fan out and sending spikes. But actually, in more recent days, in neuroscience, I would say even maybe 15, 20 years ago, but in electronics, with the advent of memristors in the last 5 or 7 years, the focus has now shifted to synapses. So now we are doing synaptocentric computation. And you'll realize that the reason is that that's because the synapses are both the site of memory, where you can actually store the strength of this communication, and computation, because they have nonlinear effects, they sum in a nonlinear way, and even because there are many of them and far and distributed, they can interact in complex ways. So the synapses are actually what is giving computational power to real neurons. In artificial intelligence, it's still there are some groups that are giving importance to synapses, but many others are still just saying, it's just a simple weight. It's either you multiply it by a factor or you don't, and that's it. But we'll see the details of that. Now, in biology, there are different types of synapses that have different proteic channels. So you'll see whenever there is a communication here, some proteic channels open up. And the proteic channels all behaves in the same way that they behave in the soma, where you have sodium, potassium, calcium, and others. Basically, they are activated by neurotransmitters, and whenever these proteic channels sense the presence of neurotransmitters and the change in the concentration, they open or close more, which means that they increase or decrease their conductance. So this is an example of a schematic diagram of a circuit that approximates the neuron, but the synapses are the ones that release the neurotransmitters, which then are responsible for opening or closing these these channels. And so you see the communication actually happens both in a, from electrical point of view and chemical. Um, the synapses can be both excitatory and inhibitory, so you can increase the amount of current that flows into the soma, into the membrane capacitance, or you can decrease it. You can take charge away from the membrane capacitance, so that would be inhibitory. And then in terms of nonlinearities, there are synapses that have these depressing or facilitating nonlinearities. I won't say much now, because we will see in a few slides what that means. But also synapses, as I will show you, they have different temporal dynamics. And depending on the time constants, how long it takes for them to build up the charge or discharge, they have different names. They are AMPA synapses and MDA synapses for the excitatory ones. The AMPA synapses are the ones that typically have, you know, single digit milliseconds, 5, 10, maybe 20 milliseconds time constants. The NMDA synapses are slower. They have time constants of the order of hundreds of milliseconds. In addition, the NMDA synapses, they have what is called a voltage gating mechanism. So their conductance, the weight, depends on the postsynaptic membrane potential. So it's also like a gating mechanism. If the membrane potential is above some threshold, then the synapse has an effect, it works. The weight is whatever is stored. If the membrane potential is below some threshold, then the synapse does not conduct. So even if the weight is very, very high, it will actually not produce any output. So again, it's like a veto mechanism or a gating mechanism that increases the computational power of these devices for doing computation. So let's look now at this first bullet item, the electrical chemical. As I told you, whenever there is an action potential arriving from the cell body, which is, by the way, very, very far away, could even be centimeters, then once it reaches the end terminal, the boutons or the synapses at the end of the axon, it will release neurotransmitters. Let's actually go and see it here. So there is an action potential that's propagating down. It reaches the end of the synapse, the synaptic terminal. It basically pushes these vesicles that have calcium towards the membrane, and the membrane reacts and starts to release calcium in the area between the presynaptic and the postsynaptic, um, in the extracellular space. So the arrival of the presynaptic action potential triggers the release of neurotransmitter in this extracellular space. The neurotransmitters react with the postsynaptic receptors. So on the postsynaptic side, there is a neuron and it has a membrane with a bilipid layer. Inside the bilipid layer are these proteic channels that are floating. These proteic channels are sensitive to the neurotransmitters that have been released in the extracellular space by the synapse. And when there is this diffusion that happens that reaches the postsynaptic terminal, these proteic channels sense the neurotransmitters and open and allow calcium influx. And so the chemical synaptic transmission is characterized by temporal dynamics that is given by this diffusion process of ions in the extracellular space. So you can imagine, even though we have electrical signals going down, maybe myelinated, which can go quite fast, once we reach the end, there is this synaptic dynamics that, because it's chemical, is quite slow. And this is, it's not like a bug of our hardware. Really, we have been optimized to have dynamics that are well matched to the signals that we want to process. So if you want to recognize the phonemes that are coming out of my voice, of my mouth, which typically are have periods of 50 milliseconds, And if you don't have a memory storage that you can go and check and compare continuously, like we do on von Neumann architectures on computers, you want to have time constants that are well matched to the speed of the signals that I'm passing through your ears. And because of that 50 milliseconds, that's the reason why these synapses have 50 milliseconds. It's like a match filter. In fact, we are very good at processing sort of natural signals like gestures, speech, motion. You know, we can check if a car is about to hit us, but we are very bad at detecting things that are either too slow or too fast. You know, ultrasounds, higher frequencies than ultrasounds, we cannot even hear. Things that move too slow, like glaciers moving, we don't even notice them. So we have been sort of our hardware has been optimized to match the dynamics of the signals that are critical for survival. So yeah, either tigers jumping at us, or bees moving around, or gestures, or speech. And again, that's a feature. Having slow components in our hardware allows us to to be very efficient in terms of power consumption. Even though there's low, there's many of them, and so all of them together can have can produce low latency with different tricks. We can see those. So slow hardware is not necessarily bad, and that's what we will try to do with the circuits that you will see in later. We will actually try to slow down silicon so that we can try to take advantage of these low power benefits that you get when you have mass filters. Of course, this is only true if you want to process sensory signals like speech. If we want to process things that are very, very fast, we have to match the time constants to the speed of the signals that we want to process. Like in, I don't know, in micromotors for hard disk control, then we would need to go at megahertz. Then we could use synapses that have time constants of microseconds instead of milliseconds, or even maybe nanoseconds. Okay, so here's what happens at the end of the synaptic terminal, more details. So as I told you, whenever the action potential arrives, there are these vesicles that contain calcium. Um, and these channels open up and release the neurotransmitter. So there's a limited number of these, I forgot the name, vesicle pockets. And so that's also why the synapse cannot go very fast. If it receives a very high frequency of spikes, at some point it will saturate, it will release the maximum, and then we will have to wait for these pockets of vesicles to replenish, to be reformed. So this is also a sort of saturating effect, which is a nonlinearity, which we will see is important. So the receptor channels opens, sodium ions enter the postsynaptic cell here. The postsynaptic cell then starts to depolarize, and then we have current flowing. Depending on how many of these receptor channels open, you have more or less influx of ions. And so the current that is being produced changes with the number of proteic channels of these receptors. And we can change the speed at which they open and the number of these channels. So if we look at the number of the channels that open, that's somewhat related to the synaptic weight. And the speed is related more to the dynamics. This is data measured from real synapses, and you can see we can measure the postsynaptic current that is produced by one of these events. And depending on, as I said, the weight, or which is proportional to the number of proteic channels, the probability of these channels to open, of several factors, we can then have more or less current flowing through these at these synapses. And so here you see we have 10 nanoamps, and you have seen already from our circuits, we can actually produce currents of this scale. And I will show you how we can produce dynamics that have these time constants. Of course, you can also measure the effect of this current on the membrane potential in a neuron. So that would be a potential, a voltage. And this is what you see here. If you have spikes at the presynaptic terminal, and you look at what's happening down the soma after these currents have reached the soma, you measure the membrane potential, and that has the effect of increasing. So with every spike, you have a change in membrane potential. In this case, this current was produced, it went down, and then it produced a depolarization of the neuron of this height with the first spike. With the second spike, there was another depolarization, with the third, another, and another. What you're seeing here is actually already, what we will discuss later, is a nonlinearity. It's a nonlinear effect because you see the first spike has an efficacy, has a synaptic weight, which is relatively high. It's a big jump up. But then when you receive the second spike, the jump is smaller. It's a lower height. And then the third spike, the jump is even smaller and then even smaller. So this is called short-term depression. The weight of the synapse decreases with every spike. And if you wait long enough, everything recovers. So after maybe 500 milliseconds or a second, the first spike will produce the same jump. But if you have like a fast sequence of spikes, well, fast in biological time scales, this is 100 milliseconds here, the synapse will change its weight depending on the number of spikes. So it's like high pass filter. Whenever you have the onset of a signal, you respond with a high response. And then as your signal stays on, you decrease the height of your response. So it's a nonlinear version of a high pass filter. So what do people do in software when people started creating neural networks from the very early on, actually from the 40s with McCulloch and Pitts? People thought, it's already complicated enough if we want to do computation using these circuits with synapses and neurons. If we have these weighted sums, let's assume that time is unity and just ignore the temporal aspect for analyzing neural computation. So McCulloch and Pitts already in 1946 basically had this assumption, which has gone on until today. And even today, as I told you, in artificial neural networks, the temporal aspect of synaptic computation is largely ignored. Only a small number of groups are starting to look into the dynamics of synapses. But most artificial neural networks assume that a synapse is just a weight. So here is just a gain term by some weight factor. So this is a classical example of artificial neural network neuron that's receiving multiple inputs. All of the inputs are multiplied by some weight, and then they are all summed together. So here you have a weighted sum of inputs, and then the output could either be a sigmoid of that, or it could be a thresholded binary version of that, or a half-wave rectified, a ReLU version of that. Can I have a raise of hands of how many of you know about ReLUs and ANNs and backprop, for example? Just to see. I need to look at the participants. Okay, here, 4. Only 5. I thought more would know about that. So this is actually, it's a really hot topic. It's AI, artificial intelligence, and it's what's driving much of the industry. Facebook, Google, everyone now is using artificial neural networks, and there is like the race to become the world leader is actually all centered on AI. Between China, Europe, and the US. It's who's going to develop the most advanced AI, which is based on these concepts. And Tesla, autonomous driving, all of these things are actually pushing for getting more performance out of networks that basically are based on this neuron. None of them of these, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Tesla, or industry-driven artificial neural networks or applied ANNs are using temporal dynamics or neuromorphic circuits for that matter. The price that they pay is power. They have to burn a lot of power for using this paradigm, and if we do the other one, we can save on power. The disadvantage of doing the spike-based temporal dynamics and using low power is that they are very noisy, and so they're not as accurate. So if you're looking for accuracy, this paradigm here is still the best one. For example, if you want to recognize, handwritten digits with 99.9% accuracy, or if you want to recognize all the faces in pictures, or all, I don't know, trains or cars in different scenes, the classical captchas, these networks are still better than classical spiking neural networks. Spiking neural networks are good where you have signals that change over time. So as I said, speech is one of them. But you could think of other measuring, like neural recordings, EMGs, EEGs, ECGs, the heart. You can do better by using spiking neural networks. Anyways, so this is just to give you a comparison between what is the industry standard and what is being done by some academic research groups to try to go beyond the state of the art. In some cases, as I said, for like static images, this is still the best way to do it, and these spiking neural networks are not really best suited for that. But for other signals, like biosignals, spiking neural networks can do better. And so now if there are no questions, I'm happy to talk about this and tell you more of what I know about startups and companies' approaches for trying to take advantage of the spikes compared to ANNs. But if there are no questions, then we could move on to circuits and show you how we can actually implement these synapses in VLSI. And we can go really, the first one is just to show you how to do a multiplication. Of course, in these types of neural networks, everything is done in pure digital world. So, you have registers, you have bit shifters and multipliers. So everything is digital, and that's why it's also higher power. But it's very well controlled. Once you fabricate a chip, you put it through a chip tester. If it passes all the tests, you're guaranteed that whatever algorithm you're simulating in software will be bit precise on the hardware. So you have full control, which is what industry really wants. If you, on the other hand, want to try to still use this paradigm here and save power, there are a few companies like Mythic, I just saw the other day, that are starting to tell you if you want to do CNN convolutions or artificial neural networks and save power, you can still do it using analog. You don't need to go to spiking. You could just use analog. And so analog computation is becoming popular again because of this push of power. So we want our cell phones to last longer and longer. And if you still want to recognize your face, when you try to turn it on, using analog can become competitive. And one way to do the multiplication here, we already saw it in the last lecture, is with the Gilbert normalizer. It's actually called the Gilbert multiplier, again, by Barry Gilbert in 1975. You can see here, you should recognize immediately a diff pair. It's a current mode circuit. You have input currents and output currents. You apply a current bias, which it will set a bias voltage here, which will then have a current bias here. If you remember the Gilbert normalizer, the output currents, after all of the corrections you made, were basically the output current was equal to the input current times IB divided by the sum. So this could be used as a multiplier by the input times IB. So you have two terms that you multiply, or a divider by the sum. So you could use it either one or the other. Sorry, there was a question in the chat. Generally, could you implement a neuromorphic approach n times and average the results to increase reliability? Yes, that's one of the tricks that we do. So the price that you pay is not so much power, but area. So there, again, if you want to do, for example, vision, where you need to process many, many pixels in parallel, if you need to average over 10, 100, or 1,000 neurons, it becomes very expensive. On the other hand, if you want to process monodimensional signals like pressure recording, neural recordings, sound, then you can afford to increase the number of neurons. You don't need as many, and so you can put populations of neurons to represent average values, and you average out the noise that's in analog. And I think this is also what Mythic is doing in their process. This is a startup that's trying to exploit flash technology, which has a lot of error correction circuits because flash is also noisy. And they are trying to put analog together with flash to do in-memory computing, and then either averaging or using error correction techniques, more fancy error correction techniques to still be able to do computation robustly with analog. Again, it's not like a general purpose computer like you would have in a CPU. You lose a lot of flexibility. But if you just want to do convolutions, then you can really optimize it and then therefore save power. Now, if we want to use spiking neural networks and still only think, where we think we can do a lot just by multiplying, there's an existence proof. All of these things we are running on our cell phones are really, really performant. So what if we want to do the spiking neural networks and just use multiplicative synaptic weights, forget about temporal dynamics? Then it's still possible to do that. And we can do that using also a single transistor. Basically, you have your spiking neuron, you have a pulsing coming in, you modulate the weight by just changing the weight bias here, which reduces or limits the amount of current that's going into the capacitor. And that gives you the synaptic weight. And so if you want to change synaptic weights, you could connect this to an A to D converter, sorry, a D to A, a DAC, or you could have other circuits that somehow store the weight here, as I was saying, maybe with flash technology. And you could have your spiking neural network with just multipliers. If you're having pulsed neural networks, another way of changing the weight is not by changing the voltage of the transistor that's sort of modulating the current going through, but it's by changing the width of the pulse. So you can either do one or the other, or both. You can see here that the change in memory potential is proportional to the weight, so the weighted current, and to the time that everything is on, to this delta t, the pulse. So you can either change delta t or you can change VW, and you get a higher effect on the memory potential change. So you have these two knobs in spiking neural networks. And these delta t's are never zero. We try to make them as small as possible, but they're usually between tens of nanoseconds to could even be hundreds of microseconds. Okay, if there is no more questions, we go to the more complicated circuits that have temporal dynamics. Because now, if we want really to, either if we're interested in rebuilding neural circuits, like small circuits of the brain, or trying to explore their computational properties, we can now move a little bit closer to biology and see if we can use the physics of the transistors to reproduce the things that are being measured in real synapses. And we'll have three circuits. I just want to show you three step by step. The first one is a nonlinear integrator. So it's really a nonlinear filter. It's easy to do. And it's basically given by the observation that if we are in subthreshold, the relationship between the voltage on the gate and the current is exponential. And if you think of these synapses that have temporal dynamics, you have these exponentially decaying traces. So you can imagine if I connect a transistor, like a PFET, to a capacitor, and I let this capacitor discharge linearly, then the current here will discharge exponentially because of this exponential relationship. So is this clear? This is quite straightforward. It's really just purely taking advantage of the exponential relationship between voltage and current in subthreshold transistors. And all you need to do is to, you give it a spike, you charge it, and then if you have a constant leakage, maybe with a constant current, or just the leakage of the capacitor. But if you want to control well with a constant current, then a constant current will leak the capacitor voltage linearly because of of this relationship. If the voltage decreases linearly, then or sorry, this is a PFET, so let's look at it this way. So we increase this voltage linearly because we have a constant input current. If the voltage increases linearly, this VGS decreases linearly. And if the VGS decreases linearly, the current decreases exponentially. So that's an easy way to have an exponential decay. But and you know, first order low pass filter, if you think of it, it's an exponential, right? If you have first order low pass filter, it would be di dt, tau di dt plus I is equal to some constant. And the solution of that is some factor times 1 minus e to the minus t over tau. We'll actually see all of these equations. But it's just to tell you that in first order linear filters, the homogeneous solution is the exponential. And so we have it here. So you would think we're done. It's really easy. We just need a constant current source, a capacitor, and then a subthreshold transistor. But that's not actually going to work. The reason is that even though we have the decay part that is an exponential, the increasing part is going to be linear. So if you just put together the what is the charging phase and the discharging phase, you have a linear charging phase because of this equation here. If you have a constant current, this will just charge up linearly, and then an exponential decay, and that is a nonlinear filter. We can actually go through the equations now. I'll just show you this. It's basically showing you what a more fancy version of the previous circuit, but we can actually go through all the details. So we can just write down all the equations. We have the capacitor, the current through the capacitor is IC dV dt. In this case, the voltage is V sin minus, it's VDD minus V sin. That's the voltage at the two sides of the capacitor. And all the other are currents in subthreshold. And for simplicity, I'm assuming that all transistors are in saturation, except the tricky one, the one that is, actually, no, they're all in saturation. So here we have three currents. We have a constant current I tau, a constant current IW, and then the output current I sin. And you can see if you give a pulse in input, and if IW is larger than I tau, the net current flowing out of the V sin node is going down. And then when the pulse finishes, IW is 0, and so the net current will only be I tau, and it will be V sin will be going up. So I sin is the exponential of that, and it will be going up and down exponentially. But now we can see what happens just before and after the spike. So in this case, before the spike, this is switched off. And so we only have this current. And so the current I sin only depends on I tau. And so the tau is the charge phase. So let's just call the charge phase tau C. And it will depend, on for as long as the impulse is not switched on. After we switch on the pulse, sorry, again, I'm confusing you. The charge phase is when the pulse is on. So during the pulse, for as long as the pulse that is on, we have a charge phase. And then when the pulse is off, we have a discharge phase. And the discharge phase is actually, charging up the capacitor, but it's actually reducing back the current, because if V sin goes to VDD, VGS goes to 0, and so the current goes to 0. So the discharge phase is when we have only I tau, and the charge phase is when we have IW minus I tau, and we are assuming that IW is greater than I tau, so we really discharge the current on the capacitor. Now, if we write these formulas and we take into account, what is the delta T, and what is the value of the IW current and the I tau current, we can derive this equation here. This is the current at time I plus 1 at the beginning of the pulse. So if we just take the difference between these two currents, we can then get to this equation here, where n is just the number of pulses that we have, and the delta t is the duration of the pulse. So we can just write this equation iteratively, and then we can assume we have more than one spike, and then we can obtain this equation. And this again, it's an equation that has different. It has something that changes with time. So if we look at 1 over time is with frequency of the input spikes, but it also has these extra terms here. So let's convert now the frequency, the n to frequency. So frequency is the number of spikes over time. If, for example, we assume 1 second, then it would be, it is corresponding to the number of spikes per second. And then you see now, if we rewrite this equation with the delta t and we put together all the time constants, we get this formula when everything is together. And we have an exponent that depends on the time constant during the charge phase, and then the time constant of the charge and discharge phases multiplied by the frequency. And this term can become positive or negative. It depends on how big is f. And only if f is smaller than some number, we have a positive term, which means that we have a decaying current. So this is just to show you that if with this constant current charge and constant current discharge, we get an equation that that will have a behavior that depends on the frequency. And if the frequency is small enough, you will always tend to go to 0, because it's e to the minus a positive number. And if t grows, this will just go to 0. And if the frequency is too large, this will just blow up. It will always go to the maximum. It will go to the VDD. So it's not really an RC-like circuit. It's not an RC filter like an RC filter. Sorry, there was a question on why I minus sin in the charge phase. So in the charge phase, we are looking at what happens just before, when we have to assume that this has been going on for some time, so we don't know what the initial condition is. So whenever we receive a spike, we have some current here that was the current that we had before the spike arrived, and that's this I minus sin. So that's just the initial condition when we are just at the beginning of the spike. There was some current which depended on the charge. We cannot assume that the charge is 0. So otherwise it would be I0. But if we're not assuming that, if we just assume that there's been some spikes so far, it's been integrating, and now we are at some condition, and this is, we just call it I minus sin. And I plus is whatever is the current after the end of the pulse. Okay, I think I was clear. Thank you for letting me know that it was okay. And then if you do the analysis, if you trust me, then these equations, this results should be correct. In the end, it really depends. If the f is small, everything leaks to 0. If f is large, everything goes to the max. So it's not really a very good synaptic circuit. It does have temporal dynamics, but it doesn't really behave like an RC circuit. Ideally, an RC circuit should produce an output current that is proportional to the frequency. Let's assume we have a step, right? If you have a step, the RC circuit should produce an output current that is proportional to the height of the step. And now if you increase the frequency, is as if we increase the height of the step. That'll also become clear in the next analysis of the circuits. But this is clearly a non-linear filter, because it either goes to the max or it goes to 0. It doesn't go to a steady state value that depends on the amplitude of the input step. So now let's look at a real linear integrator with log domain current mode circuit. This is the one that was proposed by Kwabena Boain. It's using, it's very similar if you think of, if you see the differences. It's basically just connecting the bulk of this transistor here, and nothing else has changed. But just by having one single connection, you really get something that works in a different way. And again, we can write down the circuit equations. And now this will not depend on VDD, and it's not VW minus VDD, but it's VW minus Vsin. Um, yeah, here it is. IW is Vsin minus VW. And that single difference makes a huge difference in the behavior of the circuit. We can write down the equations. Um, so we have to basically, the trick is to basically look at this equation here. Here we have a derivative. We have that the current through the capacitor is dV dt, but the V is VDD minus Vsin. And we have VDD minus Vsin here. So now if we take the derivative of this current, um, that's what we were doing here. Because it's an exponential, the derivative of this current with respect to time is the current itself, because it's the exponential, times the derivative of the voltage with respect to time. So if we apply this chain rule to this current, we get a term which is d VDD minus Vc in dt. And then we can replace that term with IC. So I'll walk you through it. So if we take the derivative of ISIN, because of its exponential nature, it will be minus ISIN times the derivative of Vsin. Now we know from the previous equation that the derivative of Vsin is related to IC. There is this relationship. So then we can replace that in. We can apply Kirchhoff's current law. I'm just skipping some steps here, but IC is equal to I tau minus IW. So dV sin is related to I tau minus IW. And if we put all of these things together, we then end up with this equation here. And I already added a term here, tau, which is defined as C sin times UT over kappa I tau. So it makes sense because the larger the capacitor, the larger the time constant. So it's intuitively, it's correct. And also the smaller the tau current, the larger the time constant. So basically this is the solution of this log domain pulse integrator. And you can see all you need to do is to have a PFET that has its well connected to its source. In terms of layout, it's actually a bit larger than necessary, because usually these transistors that have the well connected to the source, it has to be an isolated well, so it has to be kept separate from the other p-type transistors. So it's increasing the size of the layout, but it's not a big price to pay, because the capacitor also, if we want like a 1 picofarad capacitor, the layout size will be dominated by the size of the capacitor. But it's nice that you have this pure first order differential equation. And sorry, let me just go through it. In the end, the solution of this first order differential equation depends only on the initial condition that was running through the transistor here, times the leakage current I0 divided by I tau. So this is basically a steady state. So if I change IW, my output current will just reach as a steady state, after the transient, after the derivative, if we put the derivative term to 0, so at steady state, Isin will just be something that is constant. It will not go to VDD. It will be proportional to the amplitude of the input. So this is what we want. And it's actually approximating synaptic dynamics really, really well. Yeah, so it's, as I said, it's a nice circuit. It's quite compact. It has this requirement of having an isolated well because of connecting the bulk of the PFET to the source. But it gives us a first order differential equation, which is very convenient. It really models synapses really well. So then the other circuit I wanted to show you is a differential pair integrator. It's based on a differential pair. It gives the same type of equation, but it doesn't have this I0. If you notice here, this is I0 over I tau. I tau, we need to fix, if we want to fix the time constant, we have to fix it to some number. Suppose this is 1 picofarad and we want 30 millisecond time constants, then we have to fix I tau to 1 picoamp, because the 1 pico and 1 pico simplifies out. We have 25 millivolts at room temperature divided 0.7, 0.8. We're more or less around 30 milliseconds. So I tau, we cannot change it arbitrarily. We have to fix it because that will determine the time constant that we want. And so then we have a constant term here that was fixed because of the time constant requirements. And then it's divided, we're dividing the leakage current, which is usually 1 pico or even smaller, by some other number. And we don't have much control. So if we want to change the weight, this IW0 has to be very, very large, because it has to somehow counteract the fact that we are multiplying it by a very small number. So that's the other disadvantage of this circuit. One is the layout point of view. The other is that the weight, if we want the synapse to have a strong weight, it has to be a really big current. And we even risk of going out of subthreshold, where all of these equations don't hold anymore. So, so it's a potential disadvantage. And that's why I'm proposing to you another circuit, which is the differential pair integrator. So here, this is you should see there is a differential pair, these transistors. There is, similar to before, there is a transistor that sets the weight, and there is a transistor that sets the time constant of the circuit, this I tau, and then we have an IW. So what's happening? We apply a step in input to the input transistor. This is just a digital switch. That means we start to sink current, IW. If IW is greater than I tau, then the voltage on the capacitor will start to decrease. We discharge the capacitor through this current I in, which is basically the difference between I tau, IC, and IW. Because the Vsin is going down, this is a PFET, so the VGS is increasing. This will increase the current in the output. And this already should give you a hint. I'm not increasing it linearly. I'm increasing it like 1 minus e to the minus t over tau. And so this means that as time passes, whenever I have the step current, the current that's flowing through this path gets smaller and smaller until I reach a steady state. And we will actually see all of the equations, but this is because of this negative feedback. If Vsin goes down, this transistor switches off. And the more this goes down, the less current we have, the lower the output current increases. So that's already a hint that this is going to be a proper RC circuit, because it starts to look like really what an RC should look like. Then, yeah, so this is basically just saying this is the weight voltage, this is the decay, the time constant voltage. So when we stop taking the pulse, when we switch off the transistor, the weight voltage current goes to 0. And the only way to allow current to flow is to charge the capacitor. And this is a constant charge. Again, there is nowhere else for this current to go. Everything is switched off here. So we are increasing VGS linearly. And if we increase VGS linearly, that was the same trick we used before. We decrease the current exponentially. So we have an exponential both on the rising phase and on the discharging phase. So that's why this is, you will see that this is first order linear filter. Sorry, meanwhile, I keep on seeing questions. Let me see if I can read them. Why do we need to have VW? Yes, that's just a knob that allows us to control the IW current. We could just make this, and to have, sorry, let me go back here. And to have the best of both worlds. We have digital communication. So of course you're saying, I imagine you're saying you could just have a pulse that goes from 0 to VW and just use one single transistor. I think that is the observation or criticism. Yes, so it's just a convenience. We would like to be able to use digital logic for turning on and off synapses. And so in digital, then this is just going to VDD. But we also want to be able to control the weight, so the maximum amplitude of this EPSC. And we can do that by using this extra knob. So it's really convenience. As I told you before, we can change this height also by changing the pulse width. So that's another thing we could, it's an extra knob. So really there are different knobs here, and you will see there's actually, I didn't even start to talk about this other knob that is there that is also convenient. So let's go through the details of the circuit so we can talk about all of these aspects. But in order to do that, I would like to go back to last week's lecture on translinear circuits. And because of just writing the equations with pfets takes too much time, you have to write VDD minus VS. I'll just put on the next slide the complementary version of this synapse, where the differential pair is with p-type transistors, the output is with n-type transistors, and the input again is with p-type transistors. But you can imagine it's exactly the same thing. It's just a complementary version. And for that, let's see if I can actually draw on the let me on the screen and then go through by actually writing things on let me see if this works. It was working 5 minutes until 5 minutes before the lecture started, but I'm not sure it's going to work again. So I need to stop sharing the desktop. If I can figure out, oh, here, stop sharing the desktop. And I need to start sharing the window that has the tablet so I can draw on it and I can draw the circuits and go over it with you. Share screen here. Meanwhile, there was another question on the chat. So is it a digital controlling? It's a digitally triggered synapse, but it's an analog. It's controlled by the analog parameters. So let me actually draw this complementary version. Let's see if this works. Of course, it stopped working. I think I need to run it again. Let's see. Maybe I need to refresh. Okay, can everybody see some scribblings on the screen?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Let's try it. So we have an input current here, which we call I threshold. It's going to N-type transistor, which then goes to a P-type transistor. This is already weird. It doesn't happen all the time. And this is the diff pair. And on one side, we just have then there is the capacitor and then the output transistor. So let me just and the input is coming here. Let's just do it like a current source. So now this actually, yeah, this is the input could be replaced by what we had before here. This would be the pulse, and this would be VW. So it's just a shorthand for that. Now let's go through the various. If you remember the translinear loop, let's look at the voltages. And the loop I want to go through is this one. And this we call G, and this one is Vs, is the source, and this is Vc, it's the capacitor node. So now you see we have, we start from ground, so Vg minus 0 plus, I'll just write it, Vg minus 0 plus, or sorry, this is minus Vg minus Vs, G minus Vs, plus Vc minus Vs minus Vc is equal to 0. And now you can see that, right? Everything simplifies out. Vg minus Vg goes away, Vs minus Vs goes away, Vc minus Vc goes away. But if you notice, these are all the gate to source voltages of those transistors. And in addition now, as opposed to what we saw last week, some are NFET, some are PFET. So last week I told you whenever you have a plus, it's a multiplication. Whenever you have a minus, it's a division because of course of the exponent. But if you have a minus and you have a PFET, it's a double negation. So it would still be a product. It's not a division, but it's a product. Now, what is the first, the current through the first transistor, the one here? This is I threshold. So this is I threshold times the current through the other transistor. We can call this one I1 and the other one I2. So this is times I1. And then it's, in this case, it's plus a PFET. So that would be a ratio. But if we, sorry, I forgot to put I1. But if we put it on the other side of the equation, it still stays on the numerator. So this would be I2. And the other one is minus, because it's on the other side of the equation, it would be on the denominator. So but we put it on the numerator, it's still times. So this, I'm pretty sure it's correct, but please correct me if I'm wrong. But I hope you got this translinear principle trick. This is really handy. We don't have to write down all of the equations like we did in the previous analysis. We can just go through the loop. The sum of voltages is equal to 0. The product and ratios of currents is equal to 1. And the only thing I skipped is instead of putting I2 times I out on the denominator and then making it equal to 1, I already put I2 and I out on the other side of the equation. But that's, so instead of being equal to 0, I already put it on the other side of the equation. That's basically all I did. And now if you trust that this is correct, we can actually replace all of these things. And what we want to know is all of this is, we are trying to figure out what is I out as a function of the input. In this case, the input doesn't appear because we only have I1 and I2. But if we write down all the equations, we can write that as well. So I'll write the equations here. So I out, that's easy. It's just let's assume it's in saturation. So it's I0 e to the kappa V C over UT. I won't write UT for convenience. And then this I1 and I2, the sum of those is equal to I in. So I in is I1 plus I2. Then we have Kirchhoff here also. We have on the capacitor, the current through the capacitor is IC. So IC is C dV dt, this classical thing. And then the Kirchhoff's current node on IC, I2, and I tau. We have all these three currents that we have to somehow sum together. And then basically it's saying that I2 is equal, the current coming into this node is equal to the current coming out of it, I tau, and the current coming out of this other node, IC. So I2 is equal to IC plus I tau. Yeah, those are all the equations we need to look at. And then there is, again, remember the equation, if we take the derivative, so because of this I out here, if it's exponential, if we do the derivative of I out with respect to time is equal to I out itself times the, so kappa over UC dVc dt. So then we have this term here, we have this term here. We can replace that with IC. Or if we want, we can put that, we can put this dvdt in IC. So IC is equal to C times dvdt, which is basically, I'll just rewrite it as ut over kappa, I'll just on the other side. And then it's I out. I'll use the dot notation for convenience. But if you notice, if you just put these equations together, this one and this one, you get this equation here. And so then all we have to do is replace all of these things in the translinear equation here. So I threshold is I threshold, that's a constant, it stays the same, times what is I1? I1 is I in minus I2. So it's I in minus I2, but I2 is IC plus I tau. So then it's IC is this one. So it's so C ut over kappa I out over I out minus I tau. And then it's equal to, again, I2, which is I tau plus IC. So I'll write it again, I tau plus, maybe I should have I'll just leave it IC for convenience, but it's this one here, times I out. So if you now bring everything to on the left and the right, and you take you try to simplify the equation, and if you write also that tau is equal the same thing I wrote before to C ut over kappa I tau, then we can write a differential equation. Let's see if I manage to stay in the same page. Tau that multiplies 1 plus I threshold over I out plus I out is equal to I threshold over I tau times I in minus I threshold. Okay, so we're done. Sorry, you don't see the very bottom part. But the basically it's 1 plus I threshold over I out. If it's okay with everyone, I can go to the new page. So I'd have to delete this one. I don't know if you want time to take a screenshot or something, but it's all in the handout. So if I go back to sharing the slides, it's all there. It's just so that we can walk through it and you can see really the beauty of the circuit. It's really nice because you just go from the translinear equations, you replace the circuit equations here, you put them in, and you get this. It's a quite complicated nonlinear differential equation, but I can show you it really simplifies out. So let me go to the next page. I don't think there is a way of deleting things. I have to just delete everything. If no one objects, I'll just refresh. Okay, and I go to the next page here. Actually, I can also share those if anyone wants. But and also I just need to quickly redraw the circuit because it's important. Sorry about that. So also this is still not, I'm still trying to find the best way to draw on Zoom for teaching. I still haven't found the optimal solution. Tau. Okay, so we're back to the circuit. Now we had, I'll just redraw it, tau 1 plus I threshold over I out threshold over I tau, I in minus I threshold. Okay, we're here. And now you see it's a nonlinear equation. It's a nonlinear differential equation because of this term here, I threshold over I out. I out appears, it's a, first order differential equation here, but then we have an I out on the denominator, which sort of gets in the way. And it's really unintuitive to see what's going on. But remember, the capacitor gets charged and discharged depending on one condition. We can charge it as long as I in is greater than I tau. Otherwise, I tau will just always keep the capacitor discharged. If I in is greater than I tau, then the VC will start to grow, right? VC will start to grow and I out will start to grow exponentially. So this means VC goes up, which means that I out goes up even more quickly. And I threshold, which is here, is constant. And here we have I threshold over I out. So we have something that's constant divided by something that, if we just keep on stimulating, is growing and growing and growing. So at some point, I threshold over I out will become much less than 1. And if that's true, then this, something much less than 1 plus 1 is equal to 1. So this simplifies out. We have a tau di out over dt plus I out equals something. And also here, I threshold over I tau is, well, if I threshold is small, this part can be neglected. Yes, sorry. If I in is greater than I tau, then this term here is greater than I threshold. So this can be neglected as well. And that basically leads us to the first order differential equation that we had before with the log domain integrator. But with one important difference. Remember, I in could be IW. If we have a pulse and an IW weight, that would be IW. So this could be also IW. So the important difference now is that we have an I threshold over I tau. It's not I zero. If you remember before, it was the dark current, picoamps or sub picoamps over I tau. Now we have an I threshold over I tau. I threshold is a constant. We can actually set it to what we want. So let's assume that I threshold is, we can make it like 10 times I tau. So then this becomes 10, it's constant, times IW. So now we have a circuit in which we can change I tau. Remember, the I tau is also appearing here, UT over kappa I tau. So we can change I tau because suppose we want to get a time constant of 50 milliseconds, we have to fix I tau. There is no other parameter. So this is fixed. If we want 50 milliseconds, I tau has to be whatever is necessary to get this to be 50 milliseconds. So if we fix that would, whenever we change time constant, that would basically screw up all of the synaptic dynamics because it's also appearing here. But if we have a threshold that changes with I tau, and if the ratio is always 10, then our synapse will only depend on the weight, no matter what time constant we choose. So if we change the time constant, it will not change the weight. It will always be 10 times IW. In the other case, and if we don't do this trick of setting I threshold as a factor of I tau, whenever we change the time constant, we change the synaptic efficacy as well. So this is why this is an advantage. The other thing is, if you remember from last week, I cheated because I assumed that kappa is equal to 1. If we put in all these kappas, then we don't get this perfect translinear loop equation. But in this case, the symmetry of the circuit helps. So the only assumption we have to make is that the kappa of the P is equal to the kappa of the N. If that is true, then all of the kappas, if you go back to this equation where I had the VG minus VS and VC minus VS and VC, all of those actually simplify out. But the only assumption that we have to make is kappa P is equal to kappa N. But if that's true, then it's not an approximation or a distorted translinear loop. It's really pure. It's really a true translinear loop. So it's not really cheating like we were cheating last week, where I assumed kappa was equal to 1 when in reality kappa was equal to 0.7. That was actually a quite strong approximation. Here, the approximation is almost perfect because we just have to make sure that the kappa P is equal to kappa N. And if it's not, there would be a small approximation here. But essentially, this is basically the trick of this circuit. Maybe something that you have to keep in mind when you do the experiments is that this is a differential pair. And so it's assuming that these two nodes, VC and VG, are operating in approximately the same range. If you remember, the differential pair has a sigmoidal transfer function, and we are really taking advantage of this linear. In order to get an RC, the R of our RC circuit is the linear range of the differential pair. And so that's only true if VC minus VG is within some 100 millivolts. And if VC is usually close to VDD, sorry, to ground in this case, because it's always discharged whenever you're not stimulating the synapse, then VG should also be to ground. And this is very confusing because VG is the gate of a PFET. If you only look at it here, you see a PFET, and typically when you see a PFET, you would try to put VG close to VDD. But in this circuit, for this circuit to work, VG has to be close to ground. In fact, if you have a very small current, if you have a, like 10 pico, if I tau is 1 pico and I threshold is 10 pico, then this current will be very small and the log of this current will be very close to 0. So it's all consistent. But if you're doing simulations and you have to set this voltage by hand, don't be confused by the fact that you have a PFET transistor. Even though it's a PFET, the gate voltage here should be close to ground, should be, I don't know, 0.3, 0.4, 0.5 volts, but not 1.8 minus 0.3. So if everything is clear here, I can go back to the slides where you have all the same equations, but written in a nice form. Stop sharing the tablet and start sharing again the slides. That was desktop 1, share. I assume and I hope you are seeing that. And it's the same equations now. The translinear loop, we rewrote the same equations. IC, the IC is the dI out over dt times some factors. Again, the non-linear equation with the I out that gets in the way. But then if you assume that I in is greater than I tau, and if you wait long enough for I out to grow, eventually I out will just become so much larger than I threshold that this goes away. So this circuit is a very good approximation of a first order linear differential equation, provided I out is greater than I threshold. And this is true as soon as you start to integrate. This is true for large I outs. When the synapse is completely switched off and I out starts from 0, in that case, you have this term. This term is non-negligible. So at the very first spike, it will not behave like a first order linear differential equation. It will behave as this ugly thing. But with the second and third and fourth spikes, it will actually behave as a first order linear differential equation. Now, when it was hard to understand what's happening with the first spike, but if you measure it, the effect that you see is that whenever you have the first spike, the synapse reacts with a very large jump. And then with the second and third and fourth spikes, the synapse, sorry, with a small jump, with a very small jump. And then the second spike is a slightly larger jump, and the third spike a slightly larger, and then it becomes linear. Then the jump doesn't change anymore. So this is actually in biology, it's observed also. It's called short-term facilitation. We will see it in the next few slides. But just to tell you, this effect here is visible only when you start from zero. When your current is zero, everything is silent, nothing was happening, and you start simulating the synapse. The first jump, the first reaction to the spike is sees this, and then the others don't. The first spike, isn't the first spike the one having the most effect? Not with this circuit here. With this circuit, I think from what I measured, again, from the equations now, I wouldn't be able to know because it's, it's 1 over I out. But from what I measured, it was the smallest spike. And but maybe it's because it's the complementary version. It could be that in the other case, whenever we have the other synapse, but really when I measured it with this synapse, it was the other way around. Oh, sorry, close the door. But let's go on. This is measurements, exactly. This is measured from 0.8 micron chip. We actually were measuring it with the instruments. We didn't have the PCB that you have. So we could actually measure the currents, not through the C2F converter. We actually had a way to measure currents coming out of the chip. And this is data fitted with these equations. So the dashed lines are the equations, and the colored lines are measurements. And you see it's really it's really a very, very nice fit. So this is for different voltages of the weight, and we are applying a digital step. So this is a step response. It's not the impulse response. We just apply a step, and we for that lasts, a few 100 milliseconds, and we see what happens during the charge phase and the discharge phase. And the important thing, you can see it's a relay NRC circuit because first of all, it's a perfect fit with the first order differential equation, but also it doesn't go to the max. It reaches a steady state value that really depends on the input signal, which in this case is set by the VW. You can also change the time constant. So this was with a fast time constant, and this is with a slow time constant. And by changing the time constant, of course, in that case, we didn't have this I threshold equals 10 times I tau. We just had a fixed I threshold. So changing the time constant also changed the efficacy of the synapse. And you can see the scale is slightly different and the voltages are slightly different. So that's why we couldn't do exactly the same VWs. We should have set I threshold equals to I tau, and then we could have done that. This is the step response. And then if you want to look at the impulse response, that would be the response to spikes. And this again is P-type synapse. In this case, the higher the frequency, the lower the steady state. It's a complementary version of this synapse. So whenever you give one impulse, the current goes down. So it would be like an inhibitory current, and then it recovers. At the second impulse, it goes down and then it recovers. So here, for example, you see the effect of the I0 starting from 0 and then starting from the second spike on. So it's really jumping up and down. And if you calculate the mean, sort of the area under this curve, it will be around -150. This is with 10 hertz. So you give one spike, 10 spikes per second. If you give higher frequency spike, that would be the blue curve. You jump down, you recover. So the dynamics are exactly the same. You can see that they completely overlap on the first milliseconds. So the time constant is the same, the dynamics is the same, but the average of this area, the average rate, is a bit higher in absolute terms. And if you give 50 hertz, you go even higher in absolute terms. So the average is a current which is lower on the minus axis. And you can imagine if you give 100 hertz, it will then, the higher the frequency, the smaller are these big jumps. And so if you give 100 hertz or 200 hertz, you get almost a line, sort of, it will be wiggling around a line with minus 500 nanoamps or something like that. So this is the step response, sorry, the impulse response, the output current of one synapse in response to spikes of different frequencies. And finally, we can connect the synapse to the neuron. We will see neuron circuits next week, but we can connect the synapse to the neuron and measure the response of the neuron to with output spikes in response to input spikes. And that's this curve here. So here we have input spikes coming into the synapse. The synapse produces this wiggly current. The wiggly current goes into the membrane capacitance of the neuron. So it's another integrator. So we have two integration steps. This is a first linear filter. Then these currents are integrated into the neuron. The neuron, if they reach threshold, the neuron fires. The quicker they reach thresholds, the faster the neuron fires. And so this is what you see. We have input spikes, they produce currents, the currents get integrated, which produce output spikes. And depending on the weight, you change the slope of this activation function. So for those 5 of you that were acquainted with ReLUs and DACPROP and artificial neural networks, you can see this is, at some point it will saturate when we reach 200 hertz. So at that level, it will be a sigmoid. But in this region here, it works very much like a ReLU, rectified linear unit, which is sort of the workhorse of all of the artificial neural networks. And by changing the weight, you change the slope of the ReLU. So we went through all of this complexity of introducing dynamics, looking at nonlinearities, looking at first order linear filters. And now when we take rates, we go back to the very simple weight multiplication. So, and this is what like Jan LeCun is arguing, why use spikes if in the end you have to do all of this extra complexity to take the average to be able to get back to the ReLU. So I agree. If everything that one wants to do is to get an activation function that has a mean output number that changes with the mean input number, with the slope that changes on the weight, it's much easier just to do a simple Gilbert multiplier, or to use ANNs in with GPUs. But if you want to take advantage of both rate, so this type of activation functions, and time, if you want to use like, you have two complementary axes, one where you do computation by looking at spike timing, and the other where you do computation by doing, gain, like this ReLU, then with spiking neurons, you have this extra degree of freedom. With ReLUs, you only have this. And if this is all you need, then it's perfectly fine. But if you want to do speech or coincidence detection, correlation, ITD, depending on where the sound comes from, you can correlate the time that it took. Then you need it's easier if you do it with spiking neurons, and you can do it. We will see with spiking synapses and spiking neurons. Now, just a few more, actually 2 more slides. It was a long lecture, and so I didn't give you a break. But to show you that you can take advantage also of the nonlinear effects. This is all. So this is clear that everything is linear here because you're giving input rates. You linearly integrates them into average currents. The average currents go into the neuron. The neuron linearly converts the current into rates. And so everything stays linear. If you change input linearly, you change output linearly. But you can take advantage of non-linearities as well. And that's, again, something that you have if you have spike timing. If you don't have spike timing, you cannot do that. And this is the short-term depression and short-term facilitation I was talking about before, which again is equivalent to high-pass filtering in the time domain and or low-pass filtering in the time domain. So short-term depression is something that's omnipresent in our synapses. We feel it whenever we turn on something, whenever you start smelling something. If you turn on the projector, initially you hear it at the transient, and then slowly it goes away. This could be due to actually 2 things. One is short spike frequency adaptation in the neurons. So the neuron also has a sort of a high pass filter, and the other one could be through short-term depression in the synapse. So depending whether it's a global thing that every input forces you to adapt, or just the one input coming from the auditory signal, for example. If it's only from the auditory but not from the visual, it would be on the synapse, and that would be the short-term depression. If you're adapting to everything, it would be on the neuron, and that would be spike frequency adaptation. And this short-term depression circuit is actually very simple. In terms of what happens in biology, this is again data from a real synapse. Your presynaptic terminal is giving some constant inputs, bang, 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 bang. And your output first at the onset, whenever you start hearing the projector, you react or you notice it easily with a high amplitude. And as soon as you keep on hearing the same thing, you slowly adapt. It's very strong with smell. If you go in a kitchen or somewhere, initially you smell something, but quickly you stop smelling it. You stop noticing it, you adapt. And this is because of this mechanism here. And we can do exactly the same thing with circuits just by adding 3 transistors to the weight. If you remember in the synapse, let me just go back a few slides here. There is this weight synapse. You were asking, why should you have this extra knob? You could just get away with one single transistor. But if you have this extra synapse, you could store it. You could have storage of the weights, or you could do nonlinear processing. And if you change this weight value with this circuit, with these 3 extra transistors and a capacitor, you can do short-term depression. And this was actually observed by members of our institute, of the Institute of Neuroinformatics, Chris Rasche and Richard Hanloser, many years ago, almost 20 years ago. And then the way this works is actually, whenever you have a spike coming in, you discharge the capacitor a little bit. You have some leakage current going down, which decreases the weight voltage. So whenever you have the first spike, you see the weight, the full weight. But meanwhile, as the spike is happening, you're decreasing the weight. And so whenever you receive the second spike, you will see a smaller weight. And when you receive the third spike, a smaller weight and a smaller weight and a smaller weight and so on. So this is just done by discharging things. And then the way that this recovers, if you wait long enough, there is a diode here that slowly charges up the weight to a VA value. So whenever you don't have spikes, you recover and then you go back to the normal. And if you keep on being bombarded by spikes, you keep on decreasing the weight. This is the short-term depression. It's 3 transistors. It's all in subthreshold. It's all due to diffusion and these exponentials. You have exponentials with diodes, exponentials with subthreshold transistors. What Shichi's student, I think it was Michael Bögerhausen, and Shichi Liu and others did is they actually wrote down the transistor equations. They put them on a synapse. This was a older version of a log domain, or it was a linear synapse. But they were interested in analyzing these dynamics here. They wrote down the circuit equations, and then they compared the circuit equations with biology and with the equations that biologists and computational neuroscientists derived, and they found a one-to-one match. So this is data from their paper. They have a neural computations paper also like 17 years ago, but it's very amazing that the physics of the circuit here match one-to-one the physics of the synapses that were being modulated and fitted by computational neuroscientists, by Larry Abbott and Michel Sodix. So there is also this nice paper by Shichi students and Shichi that really show that in subthreshold, you can really reproduce the physics of real cells. There was a question. Do you mean referring to the neuron measurements before? Sorry, I missed that. I don't know when it was being said. But I think we are at the last slides. We can go for questions. Yeah. So this is just to show you adaptation is something that is sort of unsupervised. It just happens whenever you stimulate the synapse. These dynamics take over. But you could also have learning. So you could actually change the weight depending on some complicated formulas, depending on what's happening at the postsynaptic, depending on some reinforcement learning trace, or just complex other things. And it's possible to implement these learning algorithms, and it's a huge field of research. It's a very hot field of research for implementing learning in spiky neural networks. especially because these types of networks now appear to be very well matched to memristors. So these nanoscale resistive memory technologies that are coming out. And so if you look at the literature now, there is lots and lots of circuits that are being proposed to implement learning. And here is just a biased subset of those, because they all come from NE, except for a few exceptions. They all come from people that were at our institute. So Philip Hafliger and Misha Mahold. Misha was one of the founders of the institute. They were the first to propose a spike-based learning circuit that was actually predicting the existence of STDP. This was before STDP was even invented or found. Actually, it was the same years, but the work goes back to a year before with Misha and Philip. And then shortly after, uh, um, Henry Markram and Bee and Poo found in biology an equivalent mechanism that was actually designed in CMOS before. And then there were other people like Elisabetta Chicca and Davide Badoni and others, and Paolo Del Giudice proposed circuits independently in 2003. In Edinburgh, Adria Bofill and Alan Murray proposed their own STDP version. We also had some things early on in 2003 as well, but also in 2006, and so on. And if you go, even if you look at the latest ISCAS papers of the latest conference, you will find spike-based plasticity circuits, spike-based learning circuits. As I said, it's a really hot topic. It's going on. And if you want, next week, we can also look at some of these. Once we see the neurons, we can then look at the full synapse neuron plus learning circuit all together and see what it takes, how much area, how much space, how much power, and so on. I think that's it. So next week we'll look at silicon neurons. This week the lab will be on measuring these dynamics on the log domain if you want. That's sort of extra credit, but mainly on the DPI circuit. And maybe you can manage to see actually what happens. You can measure it yourself, what happens when everything is starting from zero, this initial condition in which this assumption is not met, and then from the first spike on when this assumption is met. And you can see if you do manage to notice this difference, because as I said, it's a very it's a very good assumption. It quickly goes to being satisfied. So it's essentially a first order low pass filter almost always. I think that's all. The lab should not be too long. There was a question actually, there was some confusion because we did not know, as you know, this year is a year of transition, about these requirements for the labs. In the OLAT, it says the first labs are required and the last two labs are required. This comes out of last year's lab sessions. For this year, it's actually probably not going to be the case. As long as you do, most of the labs, we will grant you the 3 worst. So even if you don't do 3, those will be counted as your 3 worst labs. But as long as you do the others, that will qualify you for doing the exam. So it doesn't have to be the case that you do the last 2, also because we don't know what those last 2 will be yet. But you should be doing most of the labs. And if you do 3 that you don't like, we just don't count those in for the final vote. Are there any other questions? That one was answered, I see, for the neuron measurement.